Welcome to Jeff for Banks video blog. I come to you from the road because I haven't really had a lot of desk time to sit down and do a blog post. Did a western swing of the various state banking associations executive development programs in Oregon, in Washington, and lastly in Utah. And one of the topics of discussion was the multiple bank charter strategy. A lot of Zion's employees were in the executive development program, and they had just consolidated their charters back on January 1st. And the reason given was just the burden of having, I think they had 7 or 8 charters, and the regulatory burden placed on them, and the increasing complexity to manage that many charters in terms of interest rate risk, liquidity risk, credit risk. The regulators would naturally require you to manage that by bank. So then rolling that up and managing it across the organization gets increasingly complex and adds to what might be considered diseconomies of scale. When your organization gets greater amount of complexity, you start to throw a lot of resources at managing that complexity, and it becomes inefficient to do so. Zions must have had a similar decision-making process when they decided to consolidate their charters. That process is taking place at many financial institutions. Glacier Bancorp in Montana, which I'm going to their executive development program in the next couple of weeks, very high-performing financial institution, had consolidated their charters and run them now as divisions to try to stay as close to the customer as possible. Coincidentally, I got called by a Pennsylvania Business Journal for comments on how Fulton Bank is emerging from its regulatory troubles. They ran afoul of BSA. They have 5 or 6 bank charters underneath them, underneath Fulton Financial, and I believe all of those charters were under some sort of BSA order and are now emerging from them. So they must have been trying to manage the compliance burden from the holding company across multiple banks, because all of the banks ended up under very similar orders. So what do I think about the multi-bank charter? I do think it's going away. Probably the first domino to fall was well over a decade ago when a dedicated multi-bank charter financial institution based in Baltimore known as Mercantile Bank Shares decided to begin consolidating their I think they were up to 11, 12, or 13 charters because of the complexity and the difficulty in managing them over larger geographies and as a larger financial institution. So they consolidated their charters, and they ultimately sold the PNC. Susquehanna Bank, a local Pennsylvania bank where I'm from, did the same thing. They ended up selling their bank to BB&T. So even though they had multiple bank charter strategies, they consolidated their charters, and yet they decided to upstream sell their financial institution rather than go it alone. So Glacier, on the other hand, a very high-performing financial institution, has tried to keep as close to the customer as possible by doing the divisional approach. That approach, I think, merits some consideration by those financial institutions that do the multiple charter strategy to eliminate having 5, 6, 7 groups of examiners coming in every year, submitting 5, 6, 7 call reports every quarter, having to manage the compliance complexity, the interest rate risk, and the liquidity positions of each bank, and then the whole institution as a whole. The reasons for holding those multi-bank charters that I hear from bankers, that I heard from Zion's bankers, for example, is to try to keep that closeness to the customer. And I do believe that banks can achieve that closeness to the customer if they build in the necessary flexibility in their policies to allow people closer to the customer, to give them that empowerment to make decisions on their behalf. I wrote in this blog recently about a SIFI bank that put a hold on a check I deposited for 13 days, and that hold decision was not made locally. It was actually on the teller receipt as it printed out for the deposit. So clearly they were trying to manage that type of risk across a huge geography. I think that bankers, and then when I complained about it, the branch banker did not have the authority to reduce that hold period. She had to go elsewhere and actually had to get back to me a few days later about what the decision would be. So that type of lack of empowerment is the reason why community banks can have a very large competitive advantage over those SIFI banks. But to do so, you must create a policy that gives flexibility and builds empowerment to local decision makers to make decisions that are beneficial to both the bank and the customer, and customers would appreciate it. So if I were to put away takeaways for banks that are in this multi-charter strategy, maybe moving down to a divisional strategy for to keep that closeness to the customer, I'd say these takeaways, and I wrote them down. So I make bank-wide policies that have flexibility of local decision makers to be empowered to create win-win situations between the bank and customers. So that's number one. Make flexible policies that empowers your local decision makers. Make those transparent to those local bankers so they know what is within their authority and the bank's risk appetite. So 2, make them transparent so local decision makers know what's within their authority. And 3, to make that divisional approach work and stay close to the customer, is make modifications to improve as you go along. You make a policy that provides that latitude for local decision makers, continually monitor it and see how you can make improvements to it. But the overall goal is to build a larger financial institution that keeps that close to customer roots. Many banks are abandoning the multi-charter strategy because of the complexity of managing that financial institution, but the divisional approach can work. Talk to you soon.